This is to honor someone whom I'm sorry to say many of you in this room probably have never heard of. Some of the hobby magazines have been running an ad for the last couple of months of someone in California named Hutchinson, 1149 East Hollyvale in Azusa, California. He is trying to contact someone in Evansville named Herman L. Worsich at 908 East Olmsted Avenue in Evansville. Anyone happen to know this gentleman? I don't know why this fellow Hutchinson never got an Evansville phone book, but I cut the ad out. The first thing I did when I came here was look it up, and there I found Mr. Herman L. Worsich listed in the phone book, and I called him up. And I apologize that you don't know me and you're not going to believe this, but do you have any interest in the Hutchinson family? He said, well, my whole family were Hutchinsons. I said, are you interested genealogically speaking? He said, absolutely. And I told him that this fellow Hutchinson wants to get in touch with him. We started talking, and he said, what are you doing in Evansville? I said, well, I happen to have come here for a staff club meeting to memorialize one of Evansville's leading philatelic students, Henry Meyer. He said, oh, you mean my old mathematics teacher? And he started telling me. Well, some of you may have seen in the Stat magazines a couple of items in recent months where I was soliciting anecdote stories on Henry. Unfortunately, I didn't get very many because fame is fleeting in this world. And Henry's gone 14 years, and people do forget quickly. But someone sent me a photograph of Henry Meyer directing the Evansville Cadet Band. I showed this to Henry's nephew, who's sitting over here, Leonard. He said, that's not Henry Meyer, which disappointed me greatly because I was very happy to find this picture. Well, it so happens on the back of it is a very extensive listing of covers for Charlie Towell's book on railway postmarks and Henry's writing. Now, if you knew Henry, he never threw a piece of paper out in the house. He wrote on everything. When this Evansville Cadet Band functioned, I can't tell you. Except when I spoke to Mr. Worsich on the phone, he happens to be an Evansville historian, and he had the book on the sesquicentennial. It turns out that the Evansville Cadet Band, Leonard, I can tell you, was no longer in existence the day that Henry was born. I'm going to leave all these things, though. I think this might make an interesting thing for your Evansville paper, because whenever this picture was taken, and it may have been taken in the 1870s, 1880s, and since Henry Meyer's mother lived 104, you must have some sort of longevity here. Perhaps some of these people are still alive, some of these kids. But I'm sorry to say, although this fellow has the height of Henry, and looks like Henry, I can assure you, he's not Henry. An idea of the esteem in which Henry was held, though, is a letter, and I'm not going to give you the name, even though this fellow has turned in his tongues, as the saying goes, over 40 years ago. But I remember him. I remember a lot of things in philately, because I was the guy who gave Roland Hill the idea for the first stamp. I just wish I would have made some first-day covers at the time. But I've never cared much about first-day covers, so Roland Hill went ahead and he put the stamp on covers, and I didn't even get a plate lock. But this fellow, who was never known to have parted with $1 willingly, some of you may remember, I have glasses here. Some of you may remember that the Ohio River came up and kissed your doors back in 1937. In this letter from a stamp dealer in New York. Friend Meyer, I read in the papers of the plight of Evansville, that you are underwater and what have you. If this applies to you or not, I don't know, but feeling that I might possibly help, here is a check for $100, repayable when, how, or never. This stamp dealer in New York had never met Henry. But in 1937, on January 25th, Henry's reputation for being a friend to humanity, to mankind, and to philately was well known enough to have this man send a check for $100. Here's a letter from Henry Meyer to Millard Mack, who many of you know, I'm sure, in Cincinnati. I'm not going to read all the letters. Henry had been invited to be a judge at a show in Cincinnati and wrote, "It was nice to receive your friendly letter of July 13th. I wish I could accept your invitation to help judge the exhibition, but circumstances here at our house are such that I cannot make any commitments with any hope of keeping them. The situation is this." This letter was written in 1966, 2 years before Henry died. "My mother is now 99 years old, and although she is in remarkably good health for that age, still it is not safe to leave her alone in the house. She hears almost nothing, she sees very unclearly, and she takes risks that could result in injury. I don't know how she will be later this week, and I certainly don't know how she will be in September. Each time I read something about the convention and exhibition, I feel the urge to attend, but it now seems unlikely. I almost made up my mind to be away for just one night, which would be Saturday night, so I could attend the banquet. Then I realized that if the B&O schedules are still as they were last time I passed through there, which was on my way to the West Virginia State sometime in 1963, the train reaches Cincinnati at a little after 6 p.m., so it would be 7 by the time I reach the hotel and get my room. Really a tight squeeze for the banquet. Then I would have to leave again at 7 the next morning. It is not worth the trouble to make the trip for a stay of 12 hours. There's another reason why I cannot be a judge." And he mentions, and this is typical of his modesty, this is an APS exhibition, and I am not qualified for an APS judge. I have not even seen one of the application blanks. I have not bothered to qualify because I know that my chances of being at an exhibition long enough to be a judge are very poor at present. So thanks for the compliment, but it's not practical for me to think about it. And then it's personal. Ezra Cole, who's the only one in the stamp business with a memory that goes back further than mine, was going to send me all sorts of information on Henry Meyer if he got to his attic. But Ezra Cole didn't get to the attic. I know I have a lot of stuff on Henry Meyer. I first met him at the APS convention in Chicago, 1933. I believe he taught mathematics in Evansville, and I think he collected several things. I can't remember them all, but his Hawaiians were his greatest interest. Sometime after I met him, I began executing his bids at auction. As his finances were somewhat limited, and he wasn't kidding, because Henry was not endowed with funds of this world to the extent that many more fortunate people were. But what he lacked in funds, he made up in his knowledge in knowing what he was buying. As his finances were limited, I had all sorts of bids that were sometimes quite a problem. As an auctioneer, you know, either-or bids. If you don't get this one, buy that. Don't go over so much money. And I know several times everything worked out. We were not only very friendly, but I did as well as could be done under the circumstances. At that time, he was doing some writing on Hawaiian stamps with a Colonel Gill of Baltimore. In one of the letters I said to him, as you collect Hawaiian stamps, it would help to be a millionaire. And I sure wish that Henry had $1 million, for he would have spent it for Hawaiian stamps. I then wrote him that there were several wealthy people then collecting Hawaiian stamps and mentioned Admiral Harris's name. This resulted in my introducing them to one another. Admiral Harris had Henry come to New York at his expense several times, paid all his expenses, which resulted in the end of the Meyer-Harris book on Hawaiian stamps. Those of you who may not know that the outstanding book ever written on Hawaiian stamps was done by Henry Meyer. It is a classic today. It's a very rare book. It's worth a considerable sum of money. I know this is not much help now. I will dig up some more material later on which he did it. A letter from Alaska. I read that you are going to make some remarks about Henry Meyer at the Evans Peck show. The suggestion that others of us might contribute recollections of this man is greatly appreciated. I remember him as one of the real gentlemen of philately. When I first met him, I lived in Chicago. Henry Meyer would appear from time to time at meetings of the Chicago Philatelic Society or just show up at shows of one kind or another. He was so comfortable that even beginners like me felt we could talk to him without ending up with a feeling of being overwhelmed. He patiently listened to my interest in polar philately and sent thoughtful notes when I published something. Still, I felt nothing very deep in his notice or interest until one day he sent a perfect companion whaling covers to one I had exhibited at some remote and small show. He wrote that since I had the first letter from this whaling captain, he felt I should have the second one. Today, they are special prizes in my collection because of several things. First, they are a pair. They came from such a thoughtful source, and also that he apparently was perceptive enough to recognize the cover from what must have been only a brief look at my cover. Only the captain's name identified it. My recollection does not solely stem from a gift, but from the realization that this man was interested in what I was doing at a time when collecting polar mail was hardly the vogue. He also shared with me, and I have spent these years since then trying to return his active thoughtfulness by doing the same to others. You know, kindness, they say, is like a ripple when you throw a stone into a brook, ever-growing ripples, widening as you go along. And an act of kindness done by Henry has come back. There's a second letter from this gentleman in Alaska. This is not an answer letter, only that I wanted to clarify myself. I collect polar mail, and I'm member number 1 of the American Society of Polar Philatelists. The cover Henry Meyer sent me was a companion to a major polar cover. I mention this since although I left the Midwest a number of years ago and now live in a definitely non-philatelic area of Alaska, I might still have a few friends who recognize my name, even in Indiana. George A. Hall. Any people here remember George A. Hall in this part of the world? You're all youngsters and babies. If you look at the exhibit of memorabilia from Henry's collection, you'll read about his 2 trips to Europe. Henry was born in 1896. President of the United States at the time was Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison came to Evansville when Henry was a little boy, and Henry sat on his knee. He never forgot it. Henry was in Westminster Abbey on his second trip to Europe. He began talking with an American lady there, mentioned he was from Indiana. The lady was the widow of President Benjamin Harrison. They started a correspondence. This is the type of letter that the widow of Benjamin Harrison sent Henry. A very interesting letter. The interesting thing is, as you all know, the widow of a president of the United States has the franking privilege, not given automatically, but given by an act of Congress. Mary Lord Harrison, widow of the president, had the franking privilege. She wrote a letter, addressed it to Henry A. Meyer, 516 Reed Street, Evansville, Indiana. The very stupid postmaster in Evansville charged it postage due. Despite the fact that her frank, Mary Lord Harrison, is at the upper right. Now that address, 516 Reed Street, you know, there's all sorts of famous addresses in the world. I'm not talking Washington's farewell address nor Lincoln's Gettysburg address, but 212B Baker Street. Who knows what address that is? 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. 10 Downing Street. Philatelically in Evansville, I think the only address that we knew during Henry's lifetime was 516 Reed Street. Anyway, I'm presenting this. This letter is owned by Millard Mack. It's an interesting letter. It's too long to read. The cute things in it is Mrs. Harrison. They're discussing various religions. And I was glad to know that from the exhibit of Henry Meyer, which I hope you see, that Henry apparently believed in all religions, that there's not just one way to God. There are several paths, and they all reach the same goal. But in the course of her letter, she mentioned, I don't know how it came up, about Baptists. That this pious Baptist came to heaven, was enjoying her stay in heaven, but found many friends from her home who weren't there, and said to St. Peter, what happened that all these people I think should be here? He said, well, you know, the Baptists, they always stick together. I don't know how old Arthur is, but he apparently goes back before Roland Hill. Anyone in this room know what kind of car Arthur Romerhouse drives today, if he drives? He doesn't drive. What was his last car? Well, about 1935, there was a stamp show at the LaSalle in Chicago, and I was there, and I'd driven from New York. This is the day there were no super highways then, there were no turnpikes. Driving to Chicago was a two-day proposition. And I went to get my car, and Arthur was ahead of me in line. And my car came down, and his didn't. He was a little annoyed. And he said, where's my car? So finally they checked. And the fellow says, we can't find the starter on it. I seem to recall Arthur saying, well, in 1918 they didn't have starters. And Arthur went with the garage attendant to show him how to start the car. And believe me, when that threshing machine came through, well, Charlie Towell in Tucson, Arizona, he's the fellow who dug up the picture that was not Arthur, not Henry. I see that you will speak at Evansville on Henry Meyer. He was co-author with me on Railroad Postmarks of the United States. I have a file of correspondence over 3 years with Henry, kept for his interest. He was a gentleman and a Philip student of the old school, always thinking of others, and in no way expecting financial gain out of the help extended to others. I've always thought it a loss of philately that his waterway markings book, his first love, was never published by the USPCS. I hope to correct that one of these days by putting out a waterway agent and RPO volume dedicated to Henry. One of Henry's little quirks was writing notes on almost any piece of paper that came to hand. One time he sent me a list of illustrations for our book to be checked. And when I turned it over, there was a photograph of an early period Henry with his trumpet and derby on the steps of Evansville High School. Well, we found out now it's not Evansville High School, and that it was not Henry, and that he wasn't a musician, he didn't have a trumpet. In addition to teaching mathematics, he led the cadet band. Well, that wasn't true either. The cadets may now be some of Evansville leading citizens. Well, it turns out those cadets have been dead 40, 50 years. I have been collecting covers for 47 years now. I have met or corresponded with some of the fine students of the field who taught me a lot and assisted me in many ways. Eugene Klein, Harry Conweiser, Bill Wire, Bill Hicks, Dick Ray, and so forth. But I must say, Henry Meyer, in a short period we worked together, taught me more about philatelic knowledge, dedication, and humility than any single person I've ever known. Some of you may know George Blizzle. He came from Cleveland. He was instrumental with the Garfield Perry. He told me the story of the 1946 Garfield Perry show. Now, Henry was a pretty serious guy. He didn't crack jokes. He certainly wasn't a practical joker. But the awards at the Garfield Perry in 1946 were rather unusual. There were cans of vegetables with the labels off. So when you got home, you didn't know what you were opening. The grand prize was a string of 12 frankfurters, which when Henry won, he put around his neck like a necktie and tied it. And Nelson LeGank, who was president of the club then, had announced beforehand, you're in for some surprises tonight when the awards are announced. And they were. Henry wore that string